Hello guys, and welcome back to all 1,500 members of this channel. Today is a slightly different episode. I'm just going to be talking about the 2022 regulations. I put a poll out the other day saying what set of regs were the worst in F1 recent times, and your options were the 2009 regs, 2014, 2017, 2022, and I put an option for the 2026 will be the worst regs we've ever had. And the majority of people did say the 2022 regulations were the worst, followed by the 2014. Now, obviously, the 2022 regulations, I think it's very fair to say, haven't produced the racing we all wanted. Having come off 2021, we all thought we were going to get 2021 levels of competition throughout the whole field, including the top. But really, a mixture of factors has made it so that the 2022 regulations have actually done an opposite effect. They've allowed cars to not be able to race as hard, at least in my opinion. But before that, I just want to talk about actually what makes a set of regulations bad. Obviously, the 2017 regulations, in my opinion, were a response to two things. Number one is the racing. Well, actually, that's a lie. Number two was the racing. Number two was the fact that cars couldn't get within 3.5 seconds of each other without complaining viciously about dirty air. Now, obviously, that's a massive problem. Nobody wants racing to be halted because dirty air is so prevalent. And especially on tracks like Hungary, it basically meant racing was near enough impossible. And now that is the case in which we can race on higher downforce tracks. But in my opinion, the real reason, the number one reason that these regulations were, I wouldn't say that they were in place, but I think the main thing that the FIA were hoping for when these new regulations came out were that someone else other than Mercedes were going to win the championship. And before we start getting into like what may be like the most objective territory as to whether these regulations worked and produce better racing than we've ever seen, from a subjective point of view, personally, I'm not a fan that the cars are slower. I'm not a fan that we get to see less of the aerodynamic bits on the cars. Personally, seeing a car with all its different barge board elements was just really nice to see. I preferred it over this generation of cars in which most of the aerodynamic stuff you can't really see because it is to do with the floor and the suspension. But maybe that will change with the 2026 regulations. Not only that, but one of the things I really liked about the last generation of cars is the fact that the cars were track specific in a sense. As in, we knew when we rocked up to Monaco and when we rocked up to Mexico that Red Bull were going to have the faster of the cars. But we also knew that when we rocked up to Australia or we rocked up to Bahrain or we rocked up to when we rocked to many races, that Mercedes were going to have the fastest car. But it wasn't point blank. So there were races in which if it is really power sensitive, that maybe Ferrari will be able to take the cake. Or if it was very aero sensitive, then Red Bull would be able to take the cake. And if it was somewhere in between, the Mercedes had a great chance. But it wasn't a one car is able to dominate all races because of how powerful it is. And I think that brings me on to probably one of the main criticisms I have for these set of regulations is that racing is a lot more predictable. If you guys remember in the early stages of the sprint races, but when they were just being introduced, I think in 2021, one of the main criticisms is that people were asking, what is the point of Sunday? Because now you know exactly what's going to happen. For those of you who may be newer to F1, the sprint races used to go in a format of qualifying, sprint race. So the qualifying will set the order for the sprint race, and the sprint race will set the order for the main race on Sunday. Now, if you had a horrible qualifying, you could essentially buy back many places in a sprint race, and then on Sunday, you're basically in position. Furthermore, let's say you didn't have a bad qualifying, but you have like suboptimal race pace. It means that you're going to be able to sort out whereabouts you really are in terms of race pace. So there's less fights happening on Sunday because really and truly, you qualify for the main race where your race pace is actually at, if that makes any more sense. But besides that, this generation of cars has a few things different from last generations that make it a little bit different in terms of competition. I mentioned earlier that I liked the fact that the barge boards were really complex and there was so much aero bits at the front of the cars. And although that is a subjective opinion, that also has an objective place. Because if you looked at the times, or if you were around in F1 around those times, you would know that teams were constantly going up to other teams and photographing the barge boards, photographing the front wings, and they were implementing these aero bits into the next race. Into a few weeks' time, they would come with a new upgrade package with these elements, because they can visually see what bits other cars have that really produce the downforce and really allow that car to be quick. Now, with this set of regulations, most of the aero does come from underneath, so it means that you can't really, in the sense, copy other cars. Obviously, you don't want teams to have clones of each other, but teams, obviously, they try and get what is the fastest car. They try and steal bits from each other that they find quick. So you can't really copy the fastest car. And so what makes the car quick, and partly what has made that Red Bull so elusive, is the fact that we don't actually know, or nobody really knows, what actually makes the Red Bull tick. Because what really makes the Red Bull tick isn't what we see at the top of the car, it's what's really happening underneath the car. And so since teams don't have access, maybe until someone crashes in Monaco and they have to be airlifted out, it's a lot harder to find where that pace is coming from. And similarly, on the flip end, if you look at all of the side pods and the barge boards, you will see that from the first day that, in 2022, when all of the cars were unveiled till now, let's all keep it very honest. Every car is just turning into a Red Bull clone. They're all just turning into Red Bull clones. They've all got bits and pieces that they've straight up ripped off from Red Bull that they've just seen works on that car, which is fair enough because that car is a rocket ship. But clearly some of the tactics that was used to make cars equally as fast, or the tactics that were used to balance the grid, aren't really applicable now. Which brings me on to the next point, which is that in 2014 and now, there are similar things that were implemented when the new generation of cars came out. But the main thing that makes a regulation change, in my opinion, bad is not necessarily what type of car it produces, it's what type of effect will this have in the future. And in 2014 and in 2022, both of these had regulation changes in which that one car, it is capable of one car to far exceed the grid. And it is extremely hard, near enough impossible, for everyone else to catch them in a good amount of time. In 2014, we had the regulation change to obviously the turbo hybrid engines. And Mercedes cracked these engines, and it was very top secret what they did to crack these engines. Now, most of the performance came from something no one on the grid could see. Not only could they not see it, it would take them years to catch up because they essentially were guessing. Now, although they had a basically unlimited budget, so did Mercedes. So Mercedes were able to eke out that buffer whilst everyone else was playing catch up. Similarly, in 2022, it was a ground effects era, and most of the performance came from the floor, which no one can see. But unlike in 2014, it is actually possible to see the floor, like in races where you get airlifted out, or you see in the Australian Grand Prix, George Russell's car turns on its side. These things are possible. It's possible to see the floor. So you're saying, well, Maragby, what is the limitation then? Why can't other teams catch up? And it's simple, because of the budget cap. Even if the teams know what to do to get the testing and to get the parts in and to remodel their cars, it's going to take an awful lot of money that they simply don't have. I'm not 100% against the budget cap because I understand where they're coming from, but I feel like they've done it wrong. They did the budget cap to try and limit the top teams, but they don't understand that the top teams are not that close together. They really aren't. It's rare you'll see something in which the top 5 teams are all really close together. I think we've had that at points last season, but even this season, if you look, they've started to spread out again. Red Bull and Ferrari have branched off. Mercedes are slacking. It's really rare to have the top teams together. And so to close the gap between each other, they require funding. They require finance. If you look back to 2009, the McLaren at the start of the year sucked, and they had to pour a boatload of cash to try and get essentially a B-spec model mid-season in which Lewis was able to win a race in. Now, had they had a similar style of budget cap that we have today, that would simply not be possible. And so teams are taking risks on elements. In fact, let me retract that. Teams are not taking risks on elements because if they get it wrong, they can't just spend more money to get a new element in that would work. That money is gone. It really is finite. Money is an issue in Formula One now. So teams are doing only, and I really do mean this, only what works. And what works is Red Bull. That car works. That car is stable basically everywhere it goes. That car is fast basically everywhere it goes. Speaking about the whole thing about cars being less track specific. And so what you saw with Aston Martin, what you saw with essentially Mercedes now, what you saw with Ferrari is that they start ripping elements off Red Bull to try and clone them, but really and truly they aren't able to close the gap because one, they don't fully understand that Red Bull car and its suspension, and two, Red Bull is still making upgrades and Red Bull is still pushing the pace. So it requires Red Bull to make a mistake in order for them to catch up. Remember in 2017 when Ferrari unveiled their car and it turned out their car was faster than the Mercedes. However, throughout the season, Mercedes managed to pour lots and lots of cash, and it didn't require Ferrari to make a mistake. It just required Mercedes to keep at it enough to the point where they could catch up and overtake in performance. In this day and age, it would require something like Red Bull to make a catastrophic mistake in development for someone else to catch them. Because we all know, really and truly, there is no upgrade on this planet that would bring these cars closer to Red Bull's pace truly without Red Bull making a mistake. The closest they can get is if Red Bull decide to stop developing their car for next season, and only then would they be able to challenge closer to the RB20. So we've gone over the fact that 2014 and 2022 have similar problems in which they want to end someone's dominance, Red Bull in 2014's case and Mercedes in 2022's case, and they make an environment in which one team can thrive without any competition for years on end. An engine advantage in the W09's case or 07's case, I'm not sure which car that was. And in the RB18's case, it was an aero development. But speaking from a general point of view for these 2022 cars, in my opinion, they just lack stability. They handle like absolute boats. They're heavier, they're slower around corners, and not only that, they oversteer like crazy. If you look at pole positions now versus pole positions in the last era, you can clearly see a difference in just the corrections made. And when I'm talking pole positions, I'm talking when Max is dialed in. It's clear that these cars are harder to drive for the simple reason that they just aren't that great. They're just not that great to drive. It's harder to dial in these cars. And many F1 fans will say that's a positive because it means the drivers have to work hard to drive them. But really and truly, from a race weekend to race weekend perspective, it just really means that every weekend, we never truly get to see the full potential of these cars. It's a correction here, a snap of oversteer there, an understeer here. I really would like to see someone hook up a lap. I want to see someone hook up a lap weekend on weekend, like Max can hook him up in Jeddah 2021, or maybe he's had glimpses of being able to hook it up in Monaco in 2023. But even if you look at that Monaco lap, his first two sectors weren't that great, and he would have been able to qualify really well ahead of Alonso if he hadn't had a scruffy two first sectors because of the snaps and the car being very unstable. It's only in the third sector we got to see the full power of that car because there was no snaps of oversteer. There was no understeer. And I know it's probably been played out, but can we get a replay? Can we get someone to replay the W11 doing any sort of pole lap ever? That car is on rails. And I never really get the sense that these cars are being driven to their maximum potential simply because they're inherently unstable and they're inherently hard to drive for the wrong reasons. And speaking of the wrong reasons, that leads me to the last reason in which these regulations just never ever sat right with me. And I touched upon it in a recent video. Well, not a recent video, but a recent video in terms of like, it's not that long ago in terms of videos I've made, is that these regulations and the 2026 regulations in that, they don't feel like regulations that are actually here to help racing or Formula One. These engines, this aero, it feels like regulations that are here to satisfy the higher ups of the FIA and Formula One. It doesn't feel like things that the fans want. Fans have been screaming for faster cars. I do believe it is possible for faster cars with good downforce and that are stable. But I don't think the FIA want it because they want to make F1 more in line with road cars, which I don't understand. They want to turn F1 cars from purely combustion to hybrids. And I'm sure that in the future, they're going to be leaning towards electric with a hint of combustion instead of the opposite way around. And all of this is simply marketing. I don't understand how the people, the higher ups of Formula One, think that Formula One, the pinnacle of combustion motorsport, needs to have more electricity inside it. And even with the advent of zero emissions fuel, I doubt we'll be able to see V8 engines come back or any powerful engines come back. In fact, I think they'll still keep scaling it down, all because they want to say, wow, we're more logistical, whilst they displace people building new tracks, causing so much pollution in making a track itself. They were trying to save energy by saying by 2026, we're going to get rid of tire blankets. What does tire blankets have to do with the fact F1 is increasing its calendar nearly every single year? Surely it would be better to lower the amount of races, and that will do more for the environment to lower the amount of races rather than to get rid of tire blankets. I don't understand. And to me, these regulations haven't been what they were meant to be, or they didn't live up to the hype they were meant to be, just because I don't think they were made with the foresight and knowledge of someone who actually likes F1. They were made with the foresight and knowledge of someone who likes money. Making cars more in line with road cars allows them to be more marketable. Restricting the budgets of teams instead of paying out more to the lower teams gives you more profit at the end of the year. Increasing the races gives you more money. Everything feels like Formula One and the FIA are doing the maximum amount of things to appear like they're doing it in the best interest of Formula One. But really and truly, it just feels like a money game. That money is king. No matter what you want, if it plays with Formula One's money, then it's a problem. And as regard to the 2026 regulations, obviously there's going to be a massive engine freeze, which I am 100% opposed to, because that would purely fuel imbalanced. What you want is for people to be able to upgrade their engines. You need people to be able to upgrade their engines. And obviously the 2026 regulations, I don't believe are going to solve this problem. In fact, I think they're going to make it worse. I don't see 2026 and beyond regulations beyond that making Formula One more like Formula One. I see it making Formula One more like Formula E. Do you know what it feels like? It feels like when you make a YouTube video and it's raw and it's real and it's like you're talking to your audience like a real person, and it gets demonetized. And so you go back and you re-record the video and you start subtracting bits that make it good in the first place in order to make it monetizable. Formula One is trying to be very monetizable for its audience. It spends more time worrying about Drive to Survive than its actual cars. The 2026 regulations are going to be rough. They're not going to be fun for any F1 fan from a driving perspective, because those cars feel less and less like Formula One cars. And it's about time someone said it. These regulations kind of suck. 2014 wasn't great, sure, but at least we could 2014 wasn't great, sure, but at least the FIA reverted some of those regulations to allow teams to catch Mercedes, at least try and allow teams to catch Mercedes. But now they're openly saying they won't do anything despite Red Bull's domination, which basically says to me, we got paid, so you're on your own. Personally, all I want is a competitive season in which teams can develop and can catch each other, and there is hope when you've unveiled the cars. Because as soon as the cars hit preseason testing this year, we all knew that Max was going to win the championship. Other seasons in which you maybe would class as boring, such as 2020 or 2019 or 2018 or whatever, I'm trying to think, or 2011 for that matter, you could say they were boring, but compared to this season, they're very exciting. What makes this season exciting, this current 2024 season, the only thing that really makes races exciting is when Max DNFs. Bahrain was terrible. Saudi Arabia was only interesting because of Kevin Magnussen and Lance Stroll. And Australia was basically mid apart from the fact that Max retired in the race. Everything else was bog standard average. I just want Formula One to be interesting again. I would rather have a Formula One in which there are more things to talk about on track than off track. Because honestly, whilst I was thinking of ideas to make videos on, I started to think, why can't I just not talk about anything on track? And it's because nothing actually happens on track. All that really happens is that Yuki Tsunoda whoops Daniel Ricciardo another time. All that really happens is that Yuki Tsunoda whoops Daniel Ricciardo. Logan Sargent gets pummeled for the millionth time. Everyone starts making comments about Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton's driver swap. And then you have every YouTube channel and their mother making leaked videos about drivers swapping to teams when that clearly isn't the case, or to milk views from viewers. I can't be asked, honestly. I genuinely don't care for F1 sometimes. I don't know where the sport decided to take a left turn, but at some point in time, the sport was more concerned with what happens on track and the cars and the drivers. And now I feel like F1 is more concerned with the outside stuff, such as the marketing and the politics. Maybe I'm just a bit naive, but I genuinely think F1 can return to being an amazing sport again, and it just doesn't feel that amazing most weekends. Sure, we might get 1 or 2 races in a season where we're like, wow, that's amazing, but 9 out of 10 races you could probably skip, guess the result, and whatever way it goes to, it doesn't really matter. Ferrari look like they have a really fast car this season, but again, it's like whatever. Like, it doesn't feel that interesting because they're solid second place. Maybe you could say the battle for fourth is going to be interesting this year, and I wouldn't disagree with you. And you could also say that the battle between Haas, Williams, and AlphaTauri is going to be interesting this year. And again, I wouldn't really disagree with you. But as an overarching season, I feel like there should be more to talk about other than drivers getting sacked and driver transfers. That's basically all there is to talk about right now, because F1 feels a little bit stale. And it feels stale because the FIA is allowed to get there. How many times have you seen someone say, F1 is boring, but I like this YouTuber? Or you've seen them say, F1 is boring, but I stay for the memes, or I stay for the comedy. And you start to think, why is F1 so boring? Why has it been allowed to be boring for so many years? And why is this year different? And then you realize this year is different because F1 is extremely boring and these cars just don't offer up anything. There is a genuine pleasure you can get from watching an F1 car go around the track. And I don't know about you, but I just find it in this generation of cars, I haven't really felt that feeling of speed, of being on the edge like I've had in other generations. Obviously, there's been glimpses of that. Max Verstappen's lap in Monaco is the closest I've ever felt. Well, not ever felt, but it's the closest I felt in a while to being on my edge Formula One wise. It's like, oh my, like this is tight. F1 is still interesting. I just wonder if I was a new fan coming into the sport, what would really be here to hook me in track wise, driving wise? Or would I have to rely as a new fan on off-track things to keep me interested? Because when I first came into the sport, I didn't know anything about anything off-track. All I was concerned about and all I was interested in was on track. And for some reason, it's shifted over the years to where now, as a fan, I'm looking and all I can see is off track, is where the interesting things are happening. It's either a Christian Horner scandal, or it's people being fired, or it's Gunter being fired, or it's clickbait about people joining Mercedes. It's all sorts of things. It's all sorts of nonsense. All I want is fast cars and good racing.